The gun was already pressed against Tobias Donovan's temple when Emma Bailey finally told him the truth. She stood in the center of the sheriff's office in Redemption Creek, Colorado, the autumn of 1882, pressing cold fingers through every crack in the wooden walls, and she said the words she had been running from for 300 miles. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not shake. Only her eyes betrayed her, filling with a kind of grief so deep and so old that Tobias felt it like a fist to his chest, even as the hammer of Victor Crane's revolver clicked back one deliberate theatrical notch. "My name is not Clara Holt," she said. "It was never Clara Holt." Victor Crane laughed. He was a big man, soft around the middle now, but still dangerous the way a rotting floorboard is dangerous, not by strength but by the certainty of collapse at the worst possible moment. He kept the gun where it was, the barrel cold against Tobias's skull, and his eyes never left Emma. "No," Victor said, "it is not. Tell the sheriff what your name really is, sweetheart. Tell him everything you stole from me." Tobias was very still. He was a man who had learned stillness the hard way, out on the range when a rattlesnake curls itself between your boot and your bedroll. He looked at Emma across the 10 feet of dusty plank floor, and what he felt was not fear for himself. It was something far more complicated and far more terrifying than simple fear. "Emma," he said quietly, and the way he said it made Victor's eyes flicker. Not the false name, the real one, because Tobias had known for 2 weeks now. He had known and he had said nothing, and he had chosen her anyway, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing any man in Redemption Creek had ever done. "Do not," Victor said. "Emma," Tobias said again, steady and clear as a church bell, and that was when she moved. She had come to Redemption Creek 6 weeks earlier, stepping off the morning train on a Tuesday in early September with one carpetbag clasped in both hands and a name that belonged to a dead woman. The bag was brown leather, cracked at the handle, the kind of bag that has been packed in a hurry and carried too far. The name was Clara Holt, schoolteacher from St. Louis, sent west by the Rocky Mountain Employment Agency to fill the vacant position at the Redemption Creek School. She had a letter of reference signed by a Reverend Thomas Cahill, a certificate of teaching qualification issued by the state of Missouri, and exactly $4.30 to her name. None of it was real, except the $4.30. The train platform at Redemption Creek in September of 1882 was a busy place. A plank-boarded ledge hanging off the side of the Denver and Rio Grande Western line like an afterthought, crowded with crates of dry goods and feed sacks, and 3 ranchers arguing about a land dispute that had been simmering since the previous spring. Emma stepped off the train and stood for a moment in the white September light and let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time since Kansas. She had bought the ticket in Dodge City, with the last of the money she had managed to pull from beneath the loose board under the kitchen stove before she ran. She had bought it in the name of Clara Holt because Clara Holt was dead and buried in a churchyard outside of Abilene, dead of fever at 26, and her papers had been easy to come by for a woman who knew where to look and how desperate it was to look at all. The real Emma Bailey was 24 years old. She had dark auburn hair she kept pinned tight under a gray traveling hat, gray-green eyes the color of sage after rain, and a small scar above her left eyebrow from a night 2 years ago that she did not think about if she could help it. She was from Galveston, Texas, originally, the daughter of a shipping clerk who had died of cholera when she was 11. She had been educated by nuns and by necessity, and by the kind of determined, furious reading that poor girls do when they understand that knowledge is the only inheritance they are likely to receive. She had worked as a bookkeeper in 3 different establishments before Victor Crane had walked through the door of the last one. She did not think about Victor Crane either, if she could help it. The town of Redemption Creek sat in a narrow valley between 2 ridges of the Rocky Mountain foothills, the kind of place that looks like it has been pressed there by the mountains on either side and never quite recovered from the pressure. It had a main street of compacted dirt, a mercantile, a hotel called the Grand that was neither grand nor particularly hotel-like, a church, a schoolhouse, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, and a sheriff's office with a small jail attached to its north wall. It had, as of 3 days before Emma's arrival, a new sheriff. Tobias Donovan had ridden into Redemption Creek on horseback rather than by train, which was already unusual, arriving from the direction of the mountains with a badge pinned to his coat and a letter of appointment from the territorial marshal that was somewhat more legitimate than Emma's credentials, but not by an enormous margin. He was 31 years old, 6 feet and a little more, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that noticed things with the patient, methodical attention of a man who has spent years in places where not noticing things gets you killed. He had been, before he was a sheriff, a Pinkerton detective. Before that, briefly, a soldier. Before that, the eldest son of a cattle rancher in Wyoming, who had lost the ranch to debt and drought in that order, and had sent his 3 sons out into the world with very little except the understanding that the world did not particularly owe them anything. Tobias Donovan's dark past was quieter than Emma's, which is perhaps why it had settled more evenly into the lines of his face, a quality of watchful calm that people in Redemption Creek interpreted as confidence, and that was, in fact, a great deal more complicated than that. He was outside the sheriff's office on the morning the train arrived, drinking coffee from an enamel cup and reading a week-old newspaper from Denver, when Emma Bailey walked up the main street of Redemption Creek carrying her one brown bag and wearing her borrowed name like a coat that didn't quite fit. He noticed her. He was a man who noticed things. He did not speak to her that day. He watched her speak to Harold Briggs, the town clerk, who had been managing the school hiring for the past 2 months, and he watched Harold's face go through a series of expressions that ended in evident relief. The schoolteacher had arrived. The children of Redemption Creek would not be left to educate themselves through the winter. Tobias went back to his newspaper, but he did not read it. Emma's first week in Redemption Creek was the most peaceful week she had experienced in 2 years. She was given a room in the boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Agnes Pierce, a broad-shouldered woman of 52 with iron-gray hair and an absolute refusal to engage in gossip that Emma found immediately and deeply comforting. The room was small, with a window that looked out over the back garden, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. It was the cleanest room Emma had slept in since before everything had gone wrong, and on her first night she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her palms flat against the quilt and tried very hard not to cry and mostly succeeded. She opened the school on Monday morning to find 11 children seated at desks in varying states of readiness, from a small girl in the front row who had already arranged her slate and chalk with the precision of someone who has been waiting for this moment for months, to a boy of about 10 in the back who was drawing something that was almost certainly not educational in the dust on his desktop. Emma stood at the front of the schoolroom and felt with a sudden sharp clarity that this was who she was supposed to be. Not Clara Holt, not Victor Crane's bookkeeper, not the woman who had run. This. Standing in front of children who needed to be taught, with the September light coming through clean windows and the smell of chalk dust and wood smoke and possibility. "My name is Miss Holt," she said, because she had to. The small girl in the front row, who turned out to be named Lily Briggs and was Harold Briggs's daughter, looked up at her with absolute trust, and Emma felt the borrowed name sit a little heavier on her shoulders. She met Tobias Donovan for the first time on the Wednesday of that first week. She was leaving the mercantile with a parcel of school supplies, and he was coming out of the post office next door, and they nearly collided at the corner of the boardwalk. He caught her arm to steady her, and the parcels did not fall, and they stood for a moment in the September afternoon with the mountains huge and blue in the distance behind the town. "You must be the new school teacher," he said. "Miss Holt," Emma said. Something shifted in his expression, not suspicion, Not quite, something more like a question he hadn't asked yet. "Tobias Donovan," he said. "Sheriff." "I know," Emma said. "Mrs. Pierce mentioned you. Good things, I hope. She said you drink too much coffee and you are thorough." The corner of his mouth lifted. "That's accurate." She wanted to leave. She wanted to walk away and put distance between herself and those brown eyes that noticed things, because she could already feel them noticing things about her that she needed to keep unnoticed. But her feet did not move immediately, and in the extra second she stood there, he said, "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Holt. I hope you find it to your liking." "I already do," Emma said, and that at least was entirely true. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the evening, which was exactly the kind of thing she could not afford to do. The trouble with Redemption Creek was that it was the kind of place that required you to exist in it. In a city, you could be anonymous. You could keep to yourself and have no one demand to know your history or your people or the events that had brought you to this particular street corner at this particular time. Redemption Creek was not a city. Redemption Creek was a place where everyone knew within 48 hours that the new schoolteacher had arrived on Tuesday's train with one brown bag, that she boarded with Agnes Pierce, that she took her meals quietly and read in the evenings, and that she had very nice manners but seemed sometimes to look over her shoulder when she thought no one was watching. Agnes Pierce watched. Agnes Pierce said nothing, but she watched. Emma threw herself into teaching with the totality of someone who has found the one thing that feels honest in a life that has recently become defined by dishonesty. She taught reading and arithmetic and history and geography. She organized the children by ability rather than age, which caused Harold Briggs some initial concern, and then, when he saw the results, considerable pride. She stayed late in the schoolhouse grading slates by lamplight, and planning the following day's lessons with the focused intensity that had once made her the best bookkeeper Victor Crane had ever employed. She did not think about that. She began to know the town by gradual accretion, the way you know a place when you live in it rather than pass through it. She knew that the blacksmith, a man named Pete Hollies, had a dog named Governor that followed him everywhere and was afraid of chickens. She knew that the saloon keeper at the Dusty Boot, a woman named Rosa Valdez who had come up from New Mexico 15 years ago, made the best coffee in the valley and served it in the mornings to anyone who needed it, which Emma privately thought was a more honest ministry than some churches she had attended. She knew that the mountains caught the light in the late afternoon and turned a color that had no exact name in English, something between gold and bronze, and the color of the moment just before a thing is lost. She knew that Tobias Donovan took his evening meal at the hotel most nights and walked the length of the main street twice before turning in, which she told herself she knew simply because it was useful information, and not because she timed her own evening walks to avoid it. And then 3 weeks into her time in Redemption Creek, she stopped avoiding it. It was a Thursday evening. The first cold had come down from the mountains, the kind of cold that arrives in the Colorado high country in late September with no particular warning, sharp and clear and smelling of pine and distance. Emma was walking back from the schoolhouse where she had stayed to prepare a map lesson, and Tobias was on his evening circuit, and they met at the corner where they had nearly collided before. "You are out late," he said. "Lesson planning," she said. "Those children are lucky to have you," he said. Lily Briggs told her father she is learning geography and that it is the most interesting thing that has ever happened to her. Emma smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful performed version she used when she was managing the distance between herself and the world. Tobias noticed. She could see him notice. "Can I walk you back?" he said. "The cold is coming in fast." She should have said no. She said yes. They walked the 4 blocks from the schoolhouse to Agnes Pierce's boarding house in the cold evening air, and Tobias talked about the town and the land, and a dispute he was trying to resolve between 2 ranchers over a water source without letting it turn into something that required a gun. And Emma listened and asked questions, and found that she was entirely comfortable in a way she had not expected and could not entirely afford. At the boarding house gate he paused. "Miss Holt," he said, and there was the question again, the one he hadn't asked, hovering somewhere in the way he said her name. "Good night, Sheriff," Emma said, and went inside before she could do something as impractical as being honest. This became a pattern. Thursday evenings usually, sometimes a Wednesday. Not arranged, never discussed, but consistent enough that Agnes Pierce began setting an extra cup out when she made tea on Thursdays, which Emma pretended not to notice. They talked about books and history and the children and the land and the nature of the territory and the prospects for the coming winter. They talked about everything except themselves, which is to say they talked around the question of who they each were in the way that two people do when they are both, for different reasons, keeping something back. Tobias had his own secrets. Not dark secrets in the way Emma had a dark secret, but the quieter kind that accumulate when a man has seen enough of the world's cruelty to make him cautious about feeling things too completely. He had been a Pinkerton for 4 years. He had seen what people did to each other when they thought no one was watching, or when they had convinced themselves that what they wanted justified the damage they caused. He had developed a talent for identifying deception that was now so automatic he could not turn it off, and this talent was telling him, from the first moment he saw Emma Bailey, that she was afraid of something. He did not know what. He did not push. He found, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not particularly want to push, because something about Emma, her directness, her focus, the way she was so intensely and completely present in whatever she was doing, made him want to give her whatever time she needed. This was not his usual approach. This was, in fact, entirely unlike his usual approach, which tended toward efficiency and the direct asking of relevant questions. He told himself it was patience. He was a patient man. He was lying to himself, which he recognized and filed away and declined to address for the time being. He began to conduct quiet inquiries, not aggressive ones. Just the kind of background research that a conscientious sheriff might reasonably do about a new resident of his town, making a casual inquiry to the territorial marshal's office about the Rocky Mountain Employment Agency, sending a letter to St. Louis about the credentials of a Miss Clara Holt, schoolteacher. The response, when it came, was 3 weeks later. It was brief. The Rocky Mountain Employment Agency had no record of sending a teacher named Clara Holt to Redemption Creek. The state of Missouri had issued teaching certificates to several Clara Holts over the years, but none matching the description and none currently active. Tobias read the letter twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the top drawer of his desk. Then he sat for a long time looking out the small window of the sheriff's office at the main street of Redemption Creek in the October afternoon light, and he thought about the gray-green eyes that watched the world with a quality of attention that was not quite fear, but was something related to it. And he thought about the way she laughed when one of the children said something unexpected, genuinely and completely. And he decided that whatever had made Emma Bailey run far enough to borrow a dead woman's name was not something he was going to respond to by frightening her further. He kept the letter in the drawer. He said nothing, but he watched, and he worried. And in the evenings when they walked and talked, he listened more carefully than before to everything she said and everything she did not say, trying to understand the shape of the danger without being told its name. He was in love with her. He had been, he thought with the rueful clarity of a man who has successfully refused to acknowledge something for as long as humanly possible, since approximately the second week. He had not been in love before, not like this, not with this particular quality of absolute certainty combined with complete helplessness. It was uncomfortable. It made him careful in a new way, careful not of danger but of himself, of the possibility of doing something that would make her run, because he was quite certain that Emma Bailey knew how to run and had a great deal of practice at it. Emma, for her part, was fighting the same fight and losing in the same way, which she found deeply inconvenient. She had not planned to care about this place. She had planned to stay long enough to save money, to establish enough of an identity as Clara Holt that she could move again if she needed to keep her head down and her past quiet. She had not planned for the children, for Lily Briggs's fierce, focused attention, and the boy in the back who turned out to be named James Hollies and whose drawings, when you could get him to show you what he was really working on, were extraordinary. She had not planned for Agnes Pierce, who cooked good food and asked no questions, and occasionally left a volume of poetry on the kitchen table, as if by accident, and never acknowledged doing it. She had not planned for Rosa Valdez at the Dusty Boot, who had invited Emma for coffee one morning with the directness of a woman who has decided to be your friend and will not be argued with about it. And she had absolutely, entirely, catastrophically not planned for Tobias Donovan. She knew she should tell him. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. She knew that every Thursday evening she did not tell him was another layer of betrayal, not legal betrayal but the personal kind, the kind that matters between two people who are building something honest on a foundation that is not. She told herself she would tell him when she was sure she could stay. She told herself she would tell him when she understood exactly how much danger she was still in. She told herself she would tell him when she could be certain he would not, as sheriff, feel compelled to do something about the false identity that would make her situation worse. She was, she knew, telling herself stories. The truth was simpler and harder. She was afraid that if he knew who she really was and what she had really done, she would lose him. She was afraid that what was building between them, in Thursday evening walks and borrowed books and conversations that ran up against the walls they had both built and turned back and found other directions, would stop. That he would look at her with the lawman's eyes rather than whatever he was using now, those patient, warm, thoroughly inconvenient brown eyes that made her feel simultaneously completely safe and completely exposed. She had been in Galveston and then in 3 cities since, a person who managed alone. It had not been a choice exactly. It had been a condition, and she had managed it well. She had been competent and self-sufficient and careful and entirely, profoundly alone. And now she was not, or was beginning not to be, which was terrifying in a completely different way from Victor Crane. Victor Crane, whom she had not thought about enough as it turned out. The wire came to the telegraph office on a Friday in mid-October. Emma did not know about the wire. Emma was in the schoolhouse teaching long division when the telegraph operator, a young man named Billy Marsh, brought it to the sheriff's office because it was addressed to the sheriff, and it was from a private detective in Denver named Wallace Stout, and it contained a description of a woman named Emma Louise Bailey, formerly of Galveston, Texas, wanted in the state of Kansas for theft and fraud, believed to be traveling under the name Clara Holt. Tobias read the wire standing at his desk. He read it twice. Then he sat down heavily, in the way you sit when something you have been bracing for without acknowledging the bracing finally arrives. Theft and fraud. He turned the words over. Victor Crane's name was not on the wire, but the private detective's address was a Denver office that Tobias knew, having done some work in Denver during his Pinkerton years, was frequently employed by wealthy men with complicated situations they preferred not to resolve through official channels. Theft and fraud. He thought about Emma's $4.30. He thought about the cracked handle on the brown bag. He thought about the way she sometimes looked over her shoulder. He did not think about the words in the way the law required him to think about them, as established facts. He thought about them the way he thought about evidence, as a starting point, as data that required context to become truth. He did not ride to the boarding house and arrest Emma Bailey. He put the wire in the drawer with the letter. He went and stood in the doorway of his office and drank his coffee and looked at the mountains, which were white at the top now, the first serious snow having come down to the peaks the previous week. Then he walked to the schoolhouse and stood in the doorway and watched Emma teach long division to 11 children with a fierce, patient enthusiasm that made the room feel warm. She was writing numbers on the blackboard, her sleeves pushed up to the elbows, and she was explaining the process in 3 different ways until James Hollies in the back suddenly sat up straight and said, "Oh, oh, I see it," with the expression of a person who has just watched a locked door open. Emma turned, and her face was pure delight. "There it is," she said. "That is what it feels like." She glanced up and saw Tobias in the doorway. Her expression shifted, complicated, the delight still there but something else moving through it, something wary. He nodded at her, nothing more. He left. That evening he knocked on the door of Agnes Pierce's boarding house and asked for Emma, and Agnes let him in with the air of a woman who has been expecting this conversation for some time and had strong opinions about how it should go. Emma came into the front parlor with her hands clasped in front of her and the careful expression of a person who is very afraid and hiding it extremely well. "I need to talk to you," Tobias said. "I know," Emma said. They sat down, her on the settee and him across from her in the armchair that Agnes used for her evening reading, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I received a wire today," Tobias said. Emma closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them they were very steady. "From a private detective, named Wallace Stout. Victor Crane," she said. It was not a question. "His name is not on the wire," Tobias said, "but I suspect that is who hired Stout." "Yes. What do you intend to do?" Emma said. Her voice was level. Her hands, clasped in her lap, were very still. Tobias looked at her for a long moment. "I intend to hear what you have to say," he said, "if you want to say it." Emma looked at him. Something in her face shifted, the way ice shifts in the first day of thaw, almost invisible but entirely real. "My name," she said, "is Emma Bailey." And then she told him. It took a long time, and it was not a simple story, because no true story is simple when it involves 2 years of desperate decisions made by a person who had no good options. She had been employed by Victor Crane as a bookkeeper for his freighting company in Wichita, Kansas. She had been employed there for 14 months and had been, by every objective measure, excellent at the work. She had found, in the 12th month, certain irregularities in the accounts, irregularities that, when she followed them through the books with the patient, meticulous attention that was her greatest professional talent, resolved themselves into a clear pattern of fraud against the company's investors and also against the workers who were owed wages that were being systematically siphoned. She had gone to Victor Crane with what she had found, believing, with what she now recognized as the spectacular naivety of a person who has not yet fully understood what some men are capable of, that he would want to correct the situation. Victor Crane had other ideas. He had offered her silence and a raise. When she refused, he had suggested that the consequences of her continued employment of her conscience would be severe. She had gone home that night and made a decision that she stood by even now, even in the worst moments when she lay awake calculating the cost. She stood by it. She had copied the relevant pages from the accounts book. She had gone to the territorial magistrate's office the following morning. And then she had understood what money and influence actually meant in the practical world, because within 48 hours Victor Crane, through a combination of legal maneuvers she did not entirely understand and social connections she had not fully appreciated, had transformed the situation entirely. He had produced witnesses who swore that Emma Bailey had been skimming from the accounts herself. He had produced a version of the books that told a different story from the version she had seen. He had lodged a criminal complaint against her for theft and fraud, and she had run. She had run because she had $4.30 and no family and no connections in Wichita, and because the magistrate had looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who had already decided, and she had understood that due process, for a woman without money in 1882, was not the same thing it was for a man with a great deal of it. She had run, and she had found the papers of Clara Holt, who had died 3 months before in Abilene, where Emma had briefly stopped, found the papers through a contact of the woman who ran the boarding house where Emma had stayed for 2 desperate weeks before she kept moving. She had not felt good about taking them. She had felt, she said, looking at the ceiling of Agnes Pierce's parlor with her hands still very still in her lap, that she had about 5 options available to her and 4 of them were worse. Tobias listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, there was a silence that was not empty but very full, the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are in the same room with something that matters enormously. "The documents you copied," he said finally. "Do you still have them?" Emma looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Where?" She hesitated for only a moment. "Sewn into the lining of the brown bag," she said. Tobias put both hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up at her. "Emma," he said, and it was the first time he had said her real name out loud, and the sound of it in his voice was something she had not prepared for at all. It went through her like warm light, like the first day of spring after a terrible winter. "What Crane did to you is the kind of thing that a man with enough money and enough willingness to use it as a weapon can do, but it is not invincible. Those documents can be verified by someone who knows what to look for, someone who is not under Crane's influence." "You believe me," Emma said, not a question, a recognition. "I believe you," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "You should not necessarily do that," she said. "You are a lawman. You received a wire about a fugitive." "I received a wire about a woman named Emma Bailey," he said, "who is sitting in this room and has just told me the most coherent and detailed and self-incriminating account of her own situation that I have ever heard from anyone guilty of actual theft. Guilty people do not hand you the evidence against themselves. Guilty people do not tell you where the documents are. Guilty people do not," Emma said slowly, "when they trust the person they are talking to." The silence came back. It was a different kind this time. "I need to write some letters," Tobias said, "and you need to stay in Redemption Creek and not do anything that looks like flight." "I am not going anywhere," Emma said, and meant it in more ways than the purely logistical. What followed was 2 weeks during which Emma taught school and Tobias wrote letters, and they continued their Thursday evening walks with the difference that there was now an honesty between them that was both easier and harder than what had been there before. Easier because the weight of the secret was lifted. Harder because without that useful barrier of the secret, there was nothing between them and the fact that they were falling in love with each other, which was enormous and real and required managing. They did not manage it particularly well. Or rather, they managed it in the way that 2 intelligent people manage an unavoidable truth, by talking around it constantly while neither acknowledging it directly, which resulted in conversations of tremendous subtlety and a quality of mutual awareness so intense that Agnes Pierce, who was watching from her kitchen window during one Thursday evening farewell at the gate, set down her dish towel and said to the cat, "Oh, for goodness sake." Tobias had written to a former colleague in Denver named Charles Whitmore, a man he trusted completely, who was still working with the Pinkerton agency and had access to resources and contacts that the sheriff of a small Colorado town did not. He had sent copies of Emma's documents with the letter, copies made carefully by candlelight in his office on a Sunday afternoon, while Emma sat across the desk from him and held each page steady while he transcribed it. "You are very methodical," she said, watching him work. "It is a useful quality," he said, not looking up. "It is," she said. "I like it." He did look up then, briefly, and what passed between them in that look was entirely unambiguous, and neither of them said anything about it, which required considerable effort on both sides. He had also written to the territorial marshal, not to report Emma, but to request information about Victor Crane's business dealings in Kansas, framed as background research for an ongoing inquiry. And he had sent a personal letter to a judge in Denver named Harlan Frost, whom he had worked with during his Pinkerton years and who was, unlike several of his colleagues, genuinely interested in justice rather than its more lucrative cousin, procedure. 2 weeks after Emma's confession in Agnes Pierce's parlor, Charles Whitmore arrived on the Thursday morning train with a briefcase and the kind of professional intensity that made Billy Marsh at the telegraph office straighten up instinctively, without being asked to. Whitmore went through Emma's documents in Tobias's office for 6 hours. Emma was at the school, teaching. Tobias brought Whitmore coffee and left him alone, because Charles Whitmore worked best alone and because Tobias needed to think, and he did his best thinking walking. He walked the length of the main street twice, and then out past the edge of town toward the foothills, where the aspens had gone full gold and the air smelled of cold earth and pine. He thought about Emma and what she had risked, and what she had built here, and how entirely wrong it was that she had been forced into this situation by a man with enough money to turn the machinery of the law against the one person who had tried to use it correctly. He thought about the fact that he was a lawman, and that the wire in his desk drawer named her as a fugitive, and that the correct procedural response to that wire had been to arrest her 2 weeks ago. And he thought about the fact that he would do the same thing again without hesitation. And this told him something about himself that he had known for some time but had not fully confronted, which was that Emma Bailey had entirely dismantled his careful professional distance, and he was not going to be getting it back. Whitmore's verdict, delivered over a late dinner at the hotel, was concise. The documents were genuine. The accounting irregularities they documented were real and substantial. The counter-narrative that Crane had produced was fabricated, and Whitmore could demonstrate this through specific discrepancies in the fabricated version that contradicted records held by the Kansas Pacific Railroad, which had been one of Crane's contracted clients, and which kept its own freight logs independently of Crane's books. "This man," Whitmore said, cutting his steak with the efficiency of someone who views eating as a necessary interruption of work, "has done this before, not the fraud. The retaliation. I know of 2 other cases in which Crane's employees attempted to expose him and ended up in legal difficulty that appeared entirely their own fault. The man is systematic about protecting himself. Can we build a case against him?" Tobias said. "We can build an excellent case against him," Whitmore said. "With the documentation your girl provided and the railroad records and one other set of accounts that I believe I can access through a contact in Wichita, yes." "She is not my girl," Tobias said, purely reflexively. Whitmore looked at him. "Of course not," he said, with the expression of a man who has known Tobias Donovan for 7 years and finds this particular self-deception charming. Tobias told Emma that evening. He walked to the schoolhouse at the end of the school day and waited for the children to file out, and then went in and found her at the blackboard erasing the day's work, her back to him, and said, "We have a path forward." She turned around. She had chalk on her left cheek, a white streak that she was entirely unaware of. He thought about telling her, and then thought about the fact that if he crossed the room to brush it off her face, he was not going to maintain the professional distance he was supposed to be maintaining. He told her what Whitmore had said. She listened with the total focused attention she brought to everything, and when he finished she sat down on the front edge of the teacher's desk and was quiet for a moment. "He is going to find me," she said, "before this case can be built. He has money and he has Stout, and Stout is good at his work. He found me here." "Stout found you through the employment agency records," Tobias said. "There are not many places a woman with teaching credentials goes. That trail ends here. And Stout can only act as a private agent. He cannot arrest you. Only I can arrest you." Emma looked at him. "And I am not going to arrest you," Tobias said. She looked at him for a long time with those gray-green eyes. "Why?" she said softly. "Because the law is supposed to serve justice," he said, "and in this case it has been weaponized against a person who tried to serve it. Enforcing the letter of a corrupted warrant is not the same thing as enforcing the law." Emma stood up from the desk. She crossed the schoolroom 4 steps and stood in front of him, very close. "That is an extremely principled answer," she said quietly. "I have principled reasons," he said, equally quietly, "and other kinds." The distance between them was about 12 inches, which was not a professional distance at all. "Yes," Tobias said. She kissed him, which she had decided she was going to do approximately 2 seconds after he said yes, because Emma Bailey, having spent 2 years making choices under terrible constraint, had decided that this was one choice she was going to make freely and directly, and without further delay. He kissed her back, which he had been not doing for 6 weeks, with increasing effort and decreasing conviction that it was the right approach. When they separated, both of them breathing somewhat differently than they had been 60 seconds earlier, Tobias said, "This complicates things." "Everything worth anything is complicated," Emma said. "That is a very convenient philosophy," he said. "I'm a practical woman," she said. "I adapt." He laughed, really laughed, and she felt it like sunlight. He walked her home. At the gate he stopped and turned to her and said, "Whatever happens with Crane, I want you to know that my position on your situation does not change based on the outcome." "What does that mean?" Emma said. He was quiet for a moment, arranging the words with the careful precision he brought to things that mattered. "It means," he said, "that I know who you are, the real version. And that is the version I am talking to. And the outcome of a legal case does not change what I think about her." Emma looked at him in the cold evening light, with the mountains dark behind the ridge and the first stars coming out sharp and clear in the high-altitude sky, and she thought that she had run 300 miles to find safety, and had found something she had not known to look for. "Good night, Tobias," she said. "Good night, Emma," he said. She went inside. Agnes Pierce was in the kitchen with her tea and her poetry, and she looked up when Emma came through the door and took in whatever was visible in Emma's face and said, "Good. Finally," and went back to her reading. Whitmore stayed 4 more days, working with Tobias on the documentation they would need, and then departed for Denver with Emma's originals, legally transferred under a sworn affidavit, to begin the formal process of building the case against Victor Crane. It was 3 days after Whitmore left that Victor Crane arrived on the morning train. He did not come alone. He came with Wallace Stout, the private detective, and with 2 large men whose function was not immediately specified, but was entirely clear from the way they positioned themselves when they got off the train, one on either side of Crane like punctuation marks. He came also with a legal document, signed by a Kansas circuit judge, authorizing the extradition of Emma Bailey to stand trial for theft and fraud. He went directly to the sheriff's office. Emma was at the school. She did not know he was there until one of the older children, a girl named Sarah Whitfield, who had an older brother who spent time at the Dusty Boot and had therefore developed excellent intelligence networks, came to the schoolroom door at 10 in the morning and said in a low voice that there was a man at the sheriff's office, and Rosa Valdez had sent word. Emma knew who the man was before Sarah finished speaking. She stood very still for approximately 3 seconds. Then she told the children to copy the passage from the reader that she had put on the board, that she would be back shortly, and she walked out of the schoolhouse and down the main street of Redemption Creek with a straight back and level head, because Emma Bailey was done running. She walked into the sheriff's office to find Tobias at his desk, and Victor Crane standing in front of it with the 2 large men behind him, and Wallace Stout to one side with the expression of a professional who is being paid and would prefer not to have feelings about it. Victor Crane turned when she came through the door. He had not changed much. He was still big, still soft in the middle, still wearing the kind of clothes that communicate expense rather than taste. He had the extradition papers in his hand and a smile on his face that made her stomach turn. "Well," he said, "here she is. No need to search after all." "Miss Holt," Tobias said from behind his desk, and his voice was perfectly level and he was looking at her with a directness that meant something. "My name," Emma said, looking at Tobias and not at Victor Crane, "is not Miss Holt." "No," Victor said, "it is not." "Victor Crane," Tobias said, standing up, "I am aware of who you are and why you are here. I have read the extradition order and I have several questions about its legal standing in the territory of Colorado, which has its own procedures regarding interstate extradition. I have sent a telegram to the territorial marshal this morning requesting clarification." Victor's smile thinned. "The order is legal, Sheriff. The girl is a criminal. Every order requires verification," Tobias said pleasantly. You are welcome to make yourself comfortable at the hotel while we wait for the marshal's response. I expect it within 24 hours. I am not waiting 24 hours, Victor said. With respect, Tobias said, with a quantity of respect that was precisely measured, you do not have a choice. You have a legal document that I am required to verify before I act on. That is the procedure of this territory, and it is not negotiable. Victor looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Emma. She met his gaze steadily, which she could see infuriated him. Victor Crane preferred women who did not look back directly. Fine, he said. 24 hours. He left with the two large men and Stout, and the office was quiet. The marshal's response, Emma said carefully. I did send the telegram, Tobias said. I also sent a telegram to Charles Whitmore 30 minutes before Crane arrived, because Billy Marsh has very good instincts about who gets off the morning train and why, and he sent word to me before the train stopped. How much time does the marshal's response buy us? Enough, I hope, Tobias said. Whitmore has been working faster than expected. He contacted me last night. The railroad records are in hand. He has approached Judge Frost. Frost is interested. Emma stood in the center of the sheriff's office and felt the weight of the situation settle around her, the specific weight of a thing that has been chased and is now stopping to turn and face. If the extradition goes through before Whitmore's case is built, she said, I go back to Kansas. Yes, and in Kansas Crane has a judge and a magistrate and witnesses, and I have nothing. You have me, Tobias said. She looked at him. As a legal advocate, he said then, and otherwise. Tobias, I am not going to let him take you, he said. That is not sentiment, that is a statement of intent. He built a criminal case out of fabricated evidence and intimidation, and I am going to pull that case apart piece by piece. I have done it before. Not while wearing a sheriff's badge. The badge does not change what is right, he said. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and put her hand on his arm, just the warmth of contact. What do I do? She said. Stay visible, he said. Teach your class. Let this town see you as they know you. Crane is betting on isolation, on getting you out of here before anyone has a reason to speak up. Take that bet off the table. She nodded. She went back to the schoolhouse. She taught the rest of the day's lessons with absolute concentration. And the children, who could feel that something was wrong in the way children always can, were unusually attentive and unusually good, as if they understood that this was not a day for distractions. After school, 3 parents came to see her. Harold Briggs, whose daughter Lily was Emma's most devoted student. Pete Hollies, the blacksmith, who had 3 boys in Emma's class and who arrived with the direct energy of a man who has made a decision and is acting on it. And a rancher named Martha Caldwell, a widow who ran 60 head of cattle on a property east of town, and who had the kind of face that you immediately understood does not waste time on nonsense. They had all, it emerged, heard about the man at the sheriff's office. This was Redemption Creek, and news traveled. We want to know, Harold Briggs said, what is actually happening and what this town can do. Emma told them. Not the version she would have told 6 weeks ago, careful and minimal and designed to give away as little as possible, but the whole thing, the accounts and Crane and the fabricated evidence and the run and the borrowed name and all of it, in the same clear voice she had used with Tobias in Agnes Pierce's parlor. When she finished, Martha Caldwell said, I know people in Denver, business people who have dealt with Victor Crane and would be very interested to know that there is a legal case being built against him. That would be useful, Emma said. I will send telegrams tonight, Martha said. Harold Briggs said, there are 6 members of the town council and I am one of them. If that extradition order requires local approval, you will not get an immediate unanimous vote. There will be a process. These things take time. Pete Hollies did not say anything, but made a sound that communicated, clearly, that if the 2 large men who had come in with Victor Crane caused trouble in Redemption Creek, they would find the blacksmith's hospitality considerably less warm than the sign above the hotel suggested. Emma went home to Agnes Pierce's boarding house and sat in the kitchen and cried, briefly and without apology, because she had not expected Redemption Creek to be this, had not expected to belong somewhere, and belonging somewhere was making the stakes of losing it considerably higher. Agnes Pierce made tea and did not comment on the crying. The 24 hours passed in a state of controlled tension. Crane spent the time at the hotel, sending telegrams. Stout walked the town in the methodical way of a professional surveying a situation. The two large men ate their meals and said nothing. Tobias received 2 telegrams from Whitmore, the content of which he did not share in public, but the effect of which was evident in the way he carried himself, with the particular stillness of a man who is waiting for the exact right moment. The response from the territorial marshal arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which was 1 hour before Victor Crane's deadline. Tobias read it, handed it to Billy Marsh to file, and walked across the street to the hotel. He came back 20 minutes later and went into his office and sent 3 telegrams in rapid succession. Emma did not learn what was in any of these communications until the following morning, which was the morning that Victor Crane went to the sheriff's office with the intention of forcing the extradition through by force rather than procedure, which is why he brought both large men, and why he had the gun pressed to Tobias Donovan's temple when Emma walked in. She had not been supposed to be there. Tobias had sent a message to the boarding house the previous night asking her to stay home, to let him handle the morning. She had stayed home for exactly 40 minutes before Agnes Pierce had looked at her and said, "Go." So she was there. She was there when Victor Crane said, "Tell him what your name really is." And she said it. She said, "My name is not Clara Holt. It was never Clara Holt." And Tobias said, "Emma," in the voice that was not afraid. And she moved. She did not move toward Crane. She moved to the desk and opened the top drawer, which she knew contained, because Tobias had shown her in case of exactly this kind of emergency, the secondary revolver he kept there. She had learned to shoot in Galveston as a girl from her father before he died. She had not fired a gun in 6 years. Her hands were steady. She did not point it at Crane. She pointed it at Wallace Stout. Stout was the intelligence in the room. The 2 large men were muscle without direction. Crane himself was not a man who thought clearly under genuine personal threat, because men who use money as a weapon typically have not had to develop the capacity for physical courage. But Stout was a professional, and Stout was looking at her, and doing the same calculation she was doing. "Mr. Stout," Emma said, her voice entirely level, "your employer has committed an aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer, which voids the legal standing of any extradition order he holds. This is now a criminal situation, not a civil one. You are a licensed private detective. If you are in this room when this resolves, your license is gone." Stout looked at her. He looked at the gun. He looked at Crane with the expression of a man recalculating the terms of his employment. "Additionally," Emma said, "the territorial marshal is aware of this situation. I want to tell you that specifically. The marshal's response was received yesterday afternoon. Tobias sent 3 telegrams last night. Help is not far away." Stout said quietly, "Crane." "Shut up," Crane said. "My license," Stout said, with the deliberate emphasis of a man for whom this is the most important fact in the room. Outside they heard hoofbeats. More than 1 horse coming fast. The territorial marshal's deputy and 2 additional riders had been, in fact, on the road since the previous evening, responding to Tobias's telegram. This was the help that was not far away. Emma had not known this for certain, but she had trusted Tobias's 3 telegrams, and she had been right to trust them. The sound of the horses was enough. Stout stepped back out of the doorway and then further back, and then he was through the side door of the sheriff's office, and Emma heard his footsteps moving away. Crane heard the horses. The gun did not move from Tobias's temple, but Crane's hand changed, the quality of his grip shifting from purposeful to uncertain. "It is over," Tobias said quietly. "Victor, it is over." "You cannot prove anything," Crane said. "The railroad freight logs," Tobias said. "Your own workers' wage records, the original accounts that Emma kept matched against the fabricated version you produced. A judge in Denver who is not friendly to you And now the assault charge against a sheriff in the Colorado Territory, which is a federal matter. He paused. It is over. The horses stopped outside. Voices, boots on the boardwalk. Crane lowered the gun. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the specific deflation of a man who has run out of leverage, which is the only thing that actually stops men like Victor Crane. Not conscience, not remorse, the removal of options. The deputy, a man named Carson, came through the door with his hand on his sidearm and took in the room and took Victor Crane into custody with the efficient, impersonal competence of someone who has done this before and will do it again and does not find it interesting. Emma set the revolver down on the desk. Her hands were still steady. She looked at Tobias, who was standing up now, one hand on the desk, looking at her with an expression that she would spend a long time thinking about afterward, something between relief and wonder and something larger than either. "You were supposed to stay home," he said. "Agnes told me to go," Emma said. "Of course she did," Tobias said. The aftermath was not quick and it was not clean, because legal processes are never either of those things, but it was thorough, because Tobias Donovan was a thorough man and Charles Whitmore was a thorough man and Judge Harlan Frost, it turned out, had been looking for an occasion to address the particular variety of corruption that Victor Crane represented for several years. Victor Crane was taken to Denver under the deputy's custody. The formal charges were filed over the following 2 weeks, first the assault charge and then, as Whitmore's work came together and Martha Caldwell's Denver contacts proved even more useful than anticipated, the fraud charges in Kansas, the real fraud, the systematic theft from investors and workers that Emma had documented. The fabricated case against Emma was formally dismissed within the month, the dismissal signed by the same Kansas circuit judge who had signed the extradition order, whose opinion had been substantially revised by the presentation of the railroad records. This did not happen without difficulty. There were legal arguments and procedural challenges and 2 very uncomfortable weeks in November when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Tobias rode to Denver twice, once with Whitmore and once alone, to testify and provide documentation. He left on both occasions with the specific internal distress of a man who does not want to be away from a particular person, but understands the necessity, and returned both times on the evening train, and the second time Emma was on the platform because she had, by that point, stopped pretending that she was not going to be on the platform. When the final dismissal notice arrived in Redemption Creek on a Wednesday in late November, Tobias brought it to the schoolhouse. The children were at recess. He came in and put the paper on her desk and stood back, and she read it twice, and then she sat down in her chair and pressed her hands over her face. He was there in 2 steps, his hand on her shoulder, warm and solid. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she said into her palms. She took her hands down. Her eyes were bright. She was not going to cry, not in the schoolhouse with 11 children who would be back inside in 8 minutes. "What happens now?" she said. "What do you want to happen?" he said. She looked at him. "I would like," she said carefully, "to stop being Clara Holt." "You have not been Clara Holt for some time," he said. "Officially," she said. "I would like to stop being her officially." "That," he said, "I can arrange." "And," she said, and then stopped. "Yes," he said. "I would like," she said more quietly, "to stay." The word stay hung between them with the weight of everything it contained, the schoolroom and the Thursday evenings and Agnes Pierce's poetry and the mountains in late light and all of it. "Emma," he said, and then did not say the next thing immediately, because Tobias Donovan chose his words with the care of a man who means them completely. "Emma," he said again, "I have not been a man who makes plans easily since I was about 22 and the plans I had made stopped working. I have been careful about wanting things because careful felt safer than wanting." He paused. "I am not very interested in careful at the moment." She stood up from the chair. "Neither am I," she said. He kissed her in the empty schoolroom with the November light coming through clean windows and the children's slates lined up along the chalk rail, and the sound of the children at recess outside, and it was nothing like the kiss in the schoolroom weeks before, that had been necessary and urgent and slightly desperate. This was something different. This was a rival. The bell rang. Emma stepped back and smoothed her dress, and Tobias straightened his jacket, and by the time the children came filing back through the door, they were standing at a thoroughly professional distance, Emma behind the teacher's desk and Tobias near the door, and if James Hollies noticed the particular quality of the light in the room, he was discreet enough not to mention it. Tobias left. Emma returned to teaching. Agnes Pierce had made a cake that evening, for no specified reason. She was that kind of woman. The winter came down hard on Redemption Creek in December of 1882, the kind of Colorado mountain winter that announces itself with sincerity and does not pretend otherwise. The passes were snowed in, and the trains ran irregularly, and the town turned inward in the way that small mountain towns do in hard winters, everyone existing in closer proximity, and with more mutual dependence than the warmer months require. Emma and Tobias were married in January of 1883, in the church on the corner of Main Street and River Road, on a Saturday afternoon when the temperature outside was 12 degrees, and the interior of the church was warm from the stove that Harold Briggs had stoked since early morning. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Caleb Marsh, Billy's uncle, who had a good voice and strong opinions about the sanctity of commitment, and a genuine, visible delight in officiating weddings that Emma found immediately charming. Agnes Pierce stood beside Emma and cried, comprehensively, and denied this later. Martha Caldwell was there in her good dress, which she wore with the same practicality she wore her riding clothes. Pete Hollies brought his 3 sons, who were clean and extremely well-behaved for approximately 40 minutes. Lily Briggs was there with a ribbon in her hair and a serious expression appropriate to the gravity of the occasion. James Hollies stood in the back with his hands in his pockets and grinned. Charles Whitmore sent a very nice letter and a bottle of excellent whiskey, which Tobias appreciated on both counts. Rosa Valdez provided the food, which was extraordinary. Tobias stood at the front of the church in his good coat, which he had cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and watched Emma walk down the aisle in a dress she had made herself from fabric she had bought at the mercantile dark green wool that was nothing like a wedding dress in the traditional sense, and was entirely, completely her. And he thought that in every version of his life he might have lived, none of them would have brought him here, to this cold mountain church in January. Marrying this woman who had come on the morning train with one bag and a borrowed name, and had become the realest thing in his life. She stood beside him, and they said their words to each other in voices that were clear and even and meant with totality, and when it was done and the small, warm congregation applauded, he took her hands in both of his and held them. "Hello, Emma Donovan," he said quietly. "Hello," she said, smiling so fully that the whole church felt it. They moved into a house in the spring. It was not a large house, but it was solid, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a parlor and a back porch that looked toward the mountains, which were still snow-capped in April and would be until June. Tobias had been renting it for the previous 6 months, and Emma had been at Agnes Pierce's, and the household was managed practically, and with good humor through the simple division of tasks according to aptitude, which meant that Emma handled anything involving numbers and Tobias handled anything involving physical repair, and they argued cheerfully about the furniture arrangement for a week before arriving at a solution that was, Agnes Pierce said when she came to visit, obviously right. Emma continued to teach. The town had not questioned her continued employment after the legal situation resolved, which she attributed partly to the quality of her teaching and partly to Harold Briggs, who had made it very clear in a town council meeting that the children's education was progressing better than it ever had, and he did not propose to interrupt it on technicalities. Agnes Pierce, who attended the same town council meeting by virtue of being on the library committee, said afterward that Harold had been very eloquent, and the expression on her face suggested she found this surprising. Emma sent a letter to the nuns who had educated her in Galveston, because she had always intended to and had not, because there had always been a reason not to and now there were no reasons left. She told them her name and where she was, and that she was teaching school in Colorado and married to a good man. She did not tell them everything, but she told them enough. And the letter she received back 3 months later, from the sister who had taught her to read, and who was still teaching small girls the same things in the same classroom in Galveston, made her cry in the good way that things do when they have been a long time coming. Tobias's 2 brothers, who had scattered after the loss of the Wyoming ranch, heard through the circuitous channels of family news that the eldest brother had married, and one of them, the middle brother named Patrick, made the journey to Redemption Creek in the summer, arriving unannounced on a July Tuesday with the same dark hair as Tobias and the same quality of quiet attention, though his expressed itself differently, in music rather than watchfulness. And he spent his 2-week visit on the back porch in the evenings with a harmonica, which Tobias tolerated with the long-suffering patience of a man who has heard the harmonica since childhood. Emma liked Patrick immediately and completely. She liked the way he talked to her as an equal and asked genuine questions and listened to the answers. She liked that he told her, with absolute directness on the 3rd day of his visit, that he thought Tobias had done very well for himself, and when she laughed he said he meant it entirely and was not trying to be charming. He was never easy, Patrick said about Tobias, sitting on the back porch with the July evening spread golden over the mountains. Even when we were boys, he thought too much. Felt things too hard, got very good at not showing it. I worried about him. You don't need to worry, Emma said. Patrick looked at her. No, he said, I can see that. Tobias came out with coffee and 3 cups and sat down, and the 3 of them watched the mountains go through their evening colors, which was something Emma never tired of, the way the light organized itself differently every evening as if the mountains were trying out versions of themselves and could not settle on one. This is good, Patrick said eventually, and did not specify what he meant by this, but everyone understood. Yes, Tobias said. In September of 1883, exactly 1 year after Emma had stepped off the morning train at Redemption Creek, she realized she was pregnant. She told Tobias on a Thursday evening out of habit, the 2 of them walking the familiar route from the schoolhouse in the early autumn air. She had been trying to find the right moment for 3 days and had been overthinking it in the way she sometimes overthought things, making them complicated when they were not. And finally she simply said it, in the middle of a conversation about whether the winter vegetable garden should be extended. She said, I am going to have a baby. Tobias stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the main street of Redemption Creek in the September evening light and looked at her, and what crossed his face was something she had never quite seen there before, not even in the moments of greatest clarity between them. It was the expression of a man whose world has just become larger than he had known it was going to be. Emma, he said. In the spring, I think, she said. March or April. He crossed the 2 steps between them and took her face in both hands carefully, the way you hold something extraordinary that you have been trusted with, and he kissed her forehead. A baby, he said. A baby, she confirmed. He put his arm around her shoulders and they walked the rest of the way home in the early evening, and at the gate of their house, which was not Agnes Pierce's gate but their own, he opened it and they went in together. Agnes Pierce heard the news the following morning, because Emma told her over coffee, and Agnes Pierce made a sound that was not a word exactly, but that communicated more clearly than words her complete approval of the situation. She also immediately began knitting something, with the focused energy of a woman who has been waiting for an excuse. The pregnancy was straightforward in the way that pregnancies in 1883 Colorado were straightforward, which is to say without medical intervention or particular complication, but also not without its difficulties and discomforts. Emma continued teaching through November and stopped in December when the cold and the difficulty of the walk made it impractical. She missed it immediately and kept herself busy with lesson planning and correspondence and books, and the company of Agnes Pierce and Rosa Valdez, who came for dinner every Tuesday and played cards with something approaching ferocity. Tobias was attentive in the way she had come to expect from him, not hovering, not overprotective, but present in the deep, consistent way that meant she was never uncertain of him. He made the kitchen fire in the mornings before she was up. He read to her in the evenings when her eyes tired. He had long, serious conversations with her about names, approaching the subject with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to professional matters, which made her laugh every time. They settled on Thomas for a boy, after the Reverend who had married them, and for a girl, after some debate, Margaret. Their son was born on a Wednesday morning in late March of 1884, in the bedroom of the house on Mountain Road, delivered by Dr. Ruth Henderson, who had come out from Denver the previous winter as the territory's first female physician, and who had already substantially reorganized the medical care of Redemption Creek in ways that were both necessary and occasionally controversial. He was healthy and loud and had, from the first moment, a great deal of dark hair, which Ruth Henderson said meant nothing about future hair color, and which Emma and Tobias privately chose to interpret as evidence that he was already following the family pattern. Thomas James Donovan. They had added James, Emma said, because of James Holly's and his drawings, because that boy's determination to see the world differently seemed like the right spirit to carry a child through. Tobias held his son for the first time with the careful, wondering expression of a man who has understood something new about himself, which is that there is no limit to the things you can love, and that the capacity for it grows to accommodate what is given to you. Emma watched him hold their son in the afternoon light that came through the bedroom window, the mountains visible through the glass, white-capped still in March, and she thought about the morning she had stepped off the train with one bag and a borrowed name, and no idea what was waiting for her, and she thought that even at her most desperate she had not dared to imagine this exact, ordinary, extraordinary moment. She had not dared to imagine being safe. She had not dared to imagine belonging somewhere. She had not dared to imagine being known, completely and without reservation, by someone who found the complete knowing to be a reason to stay rather than a reason to go. She had not dared to imagine Tobias Donovan. Thomas was a wonderful baby, which Emma said quietly to herself, and did not say out loud because she had heard enough from other mothers to know that this was the kind of thing that invites the universe to correct your assessment. He was strong and curious and increasingly determined to interact with the world on his own terms, which by the time he was pulling himself upright against the furniture showed signs of being considerable terms. Lily Briggs came to visit Thomas regularly. She sat very straight in the parlor chair and held him with the precise seriousness of a 12-year-old who has given this considerable thought, and she told him about geography and long division because she had been told, she said, that it was important to talk to babies. "Who told you that?" Emma said. "You did," Lily said. "Last autumn, you said language is the first foundation of thought." "I did say that," Emma said. James Hollies came once, stuck his head in the door, said the baby looked fine to him, and left, which was exactly what Emma would have predicted and which she found completely satisfying. The school hired a second teacher in the autumn of 1884 because enrollment had grown and the curriculum Emma had built had expanded beyond what one teacher could adequately manage. The new teacher was a young woman named Frances Webb, who arrived from Denver with legitimate credentials and one trunk, and the kind of organized determination that Emma recognized from her own arrival, though without the desperation, and who turned out to be an excellent teacher and a genuine pleasure to work with. Emma returned to teaching in January of 1885, part-time at first and then full-time by spring, sharing the school equally with Frances in an arrangement that worked because they thought differently enough to complement each other and similarly enough to agree on what mattered. She had been worried, in a quiet way she had not shared with Tobias, about going back. Not about the teaching itself, but about leaving Thomas, about the particular quality of maternal guilt that she had been told was coming, and had somewhat hoped to avoid and had not quite. What she found was more complex and more satisfying than she had expected, which was that she was a better teacher for having been a mother and a better mother for having returned to teaching, and that the two things did not diminish each other but made each other larger. She told Tobias this on a Thursday evening in April of 1885, walking the familiar route in the spring air, Thomas asleep at home under Agnes Pierce's supervision. Agnes had essentially adopted the role of grandmother without being asked, which no one objected to. "I know," Tobias said. "You knew already. I could see it," he said. "From the first week you went back, something settled in you." "You are always noticing things," she said. "It is a habit," he said. "Sometimes it is inconvenient," she said, "and sometimes it is the best thing about you." "Only sometimes," he said. She took his arm, which she did sometimes when the evenings were good and she did not require a reason. The spring of 1885 was the most beautiful spring Emma could remember in Redemption Creek, which may have been objectively true or may have been the particular way that happiness makes good weather better. The creek ran high and clear from the snowmelt. The aspens came in bright gold green, and the mountains showed themselves with unusual clarity for weeks. No afternoon clouds, just the vast blue above the white peaks. Victor Crane's trial in Denver concluded in February of 1885, after a legal process that had taken considerably longer than expected and been considerably more complicated than Whitmore had initially anticipated. He was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to pervert justice, the latter relating specifically to the fabricated case against Emma. He was sentenced to 5 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. Tobias read the letter from Judge Frost out loud at the breakfast table on the morning it arrived. Emma listened and then said nothing for a moment and then said, "Good," with a very settled finality. "Yes," Tobias said. "And Stout," Emma said. "Lost his license," Tobias said, "as he was warned he would." Emma poured her coffee. Thomas, in his high chair, threw a piece of biscuit, which landed on the floor and which the cat, who had arrived at their house the previous autumn in the unexplained way that cats arrive at houses they have chosen, immediately retrieved. "It is done," Emma said, for the second time in their life together, and this time it was absolutely and entirely true. She thought about writing to Clara Holt's family, if she could find them, to return the name she had borrowed. She had thought about this intermittently for 2 years, a quiet responsibility she had carried. She found them through a letter to the church in Abilene where Clara had been buried, a sister in St. Louis named Mary. She wrote a careful, honest letter explaining that she had used Clara's papers in a desperate situation, and that she was sorry, and that she hoped Mary could understand the circumstances, if not entirely forgive them. Mary wrote back. Her letter was not warm, but it was not unkind. She said that Clara would have wanted to help someone in trouble. She said she was glad the papers had served a purpose. She did not ask for anything. Emma folded the letter and put it in the cedar box she kept on the bedroom dresser, where she kept the things that mattered. The letter from the nun in Galveston, the legal document that cleared her name, a pressed aspen leaf from the first fall she had walked the mountains with Tobias, which he had picked up and handed to her without comment, which was very like him. Thomas's first word was not mama or papa. It was dog, which he said with great firmness on a Tuesday in June of 1885, pointing at Governor the blacksmith's dog, who was passing the front porch with Pete Hollies on their way to the smithy. "Dog," Thomas said. "Yes," Emma said. "That is a dog." Thomas considered this, satisfied with himself. Tobias, who was on the porch with his morning coffee, said, "Well, that is decided then." "Dog," Thomas said again, to make sure everyone understood. The summer of 1885 passed in the full, warm, ordinary way that good summers do, full of small things that are large when you add them up. Emma's school had by September 22 children and 2 teachers, and a new chalkboard that the town council had approved in the spring budget. Francis Webb had become a genuine friend, the kind of friend you talk to honestly and who talks to you honestly back, which Emma found she valued more than she had realized she missed it. Tobias had, over the 3 years of his tenure, transformed the law enforcement of Redemption Creek from a reactive, improvised affair into something that actually functioned, maintaining peace through the more useful tools of relationship and reputation rather than primarily through force, which was not the common approach in frontier law enforcement, but which proved effective. He had the respect of the town, which he wore lightly, and the trust of the ranchers, which he had earned by resolving 3 disputes without bloodshed that had seemed certain to involve it. He had also, quietly, written a long paper about the use of fraudulent legal process as a weapon of social control, based on the Crane case and 2 others he had researched, and sent it to the Denver Legal Journal, which published it in the autumn of 1885. He did not mention this to Emma until the journal arrived with the post. She read it at the kitchen table while Thomas sat on her lap and chewed on a wooden spoon, and when she finished she looked up at Tobias, who was watching her from across the table with that patient, quiet attention. "This is about me," she said. "About the legal principle," he said. "About me," she said. "Among others," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Thank you," she said. "I meant what I said," he said. "The law is supposed to serve justice. When it does not, someone should say so." "Someone did," Emma said. They celebrated their 2nd wedding anniversary in January of 1885 with a dinner at the Dusty Boot, where Rosa Valdez had made a lamb stew that was extraordinary and provided the good wine from her private reserve without being asked. Agnes Pierce watched Thomas. Patrick had sent a letter and a new harmonica for Tobias, which he did not need, and a piece of turquoise jewelry for Emma that was beautiful. It was a quiet celebration. They did not need a large one. They sat across from each other in the warm saloon with the winter outside and the good food and wine between them, and they talked the way they always talked, freely and honestly, and with the specific pleasure of 2 people who enjoy each other's minds as thoroughly as they enjoy each other's company. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Emma said, which was a thing they had started doing, not from lack of knowledge but from the pleasure of continued discovery. Tobias thought about it. "I wanted to be a teacher," he said. "When I was young, before the ranch failed and everything went sideways." Emma looked at him. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only that I think you are one, just not in a schoolroom." He considered this. "You may be right," he said. "I usually am," she said. "That is not strictly accurate," he said. "More often than not," she said. "That is fair," he said. In the spring of 1886, Emma knew she was pregnant again. She told Tobias differently this time, not in the middle of the main street but in the kitchen, very early in the morning before Thomas was awake, when the mountains were pink through the window and the coffee was fresh. She simply handed him his cup and said, "We are going to have another baby." He took the cup and he took her hand in the same motion and stood for a moment in the pink mountain light and said, "Thomas is going to be very opinionated about this." "He is opinionated about everything," Emma said. "He comes by it naturally," Tobias said, with a look that was entirely affectionate and slightly pointed. "From both sides," Emma said. Thomas was indeed opinionated about the baby, though his primary position, once the concept had been explained in terms he could engage with, was that the baby should be a dog, which position he held firmly through the entire summer, and was only somewhat revised upon the arrival of his sister Margaret in November of 1886. Margaret Ruth Donovan, the second name for Dr. Henderson who had delivered both of them, was a calm and interested child from the first hour, looking at the world with wide eyes that were already showing signs of the gray-green that was Emma's, and who would grow into a girl of tremendous quiet determination and a laugh that was entirely her father's. Thomas's initial assessment of Margaret was cautiously positive. He reported to Agnes Pierce, who asked his opinion, that Margaret was very small but seemed all right. By the end of the first week, He had progressed to showing her things, holding objects up close to her face, and explaining what they were with the patient thoroughness he had apparently inherited directly. Emma watched her son explain a wooden horse to her daughter from the doorway, and felt the specific quality of happiness that has no single word because it is made of too many things at once: gratitude and love, and the present moment's fullness, and the knowledge that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Tobias came to stand beside her in the doorway. "He is going to be a good older brother," Emma said. "He is," Tobias said, "bossy but good." "He is 2 years old," Emma said. "Bossy starts early," Tobias said. She leaned against his shoulder and they watched their children in the afternoon light. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was cold but not brutal, not by Colorado standards. The town had grown in the 4 years since Emma's arrival: new families, a second mercantile, a small newspaper that Harold Briggs's eldest son had started printing from a press brought up from Denver. The school enrollment had grown to 31 children, and Francis Webb had suggested, and Emma had agreed, that they needed a third room added to the schoolhouse, which the town council approved with only minor argument in the spring budget of 1887. Emma was on the school board by then, appointed the previous autumn, which caused some initial discomfort in certain quarters of the town and no discomfort at all in others. She was, by general consensus, the most organized member of the board, which was not surprising, and the most direct, which was sometimes surprising to people who had not paid attention. Tobias was reappointed to a second term as sheriff in the elections of 1886, running unopposed, which he found somewhat embarrassing, and which the town found simply accurate. He had put down roots here in the way a man does when he stops thinking about a place as temporary and starts thinking about it as home, which is a different way of standing in a landscape, more deliberate, more invested. He had in his second term taken on a deputy, a young man named Henry Cross, who was 22 and smart and slightly overconfident in the way of young men who are smart and know it but have not yet had the experience that turns knowledge into wisdom. Tobias managed him with the particular patience of someone who recognizes a younger version of a quality in himself. Emma met Henry Cross at a Sunday dinner, and within 20 minutes had identified that he was in love with Francis Webb, which she did not mention to Henry, but did mention to Francis the following Tuesday. Francis Webb's response to this information was dignified silence of approximately 4 seconds, followed by a frank admission that she was also, yes, she supposed she was, aware of Henry Cross. By the following spring they were walking out together, which Agnes Pierce observed with satisfaction. "I am not responsible for this," Emma said. "You absolutely are," Agnes said. "I only told Francis what was visible," Emma said. "You made what was visible discussable," Agnes said, "which is not nothing." Emma conceded this point. Thomas's second birthday and Margaret's first birthday in the autumn of 1887 were celebrated together, a party in the backyard of the house on Mountain Road on a Saturday afternoon in October, with the aspens at their full gold, and the sky that specific Colorado blue that Emma still had not found the right word for and had stopped trying. Agnes Pierce brought food that could not all be eaten in one afternoon. Rosa Valdez brought wine. Martha Caldwell came with a carved wooden train for Thomas, which he accepted with serious gratitude. Lily Briggs, who was now 15 and considerably taller and still ferociously interested in geography, came and spent most of the afternoon teaching Thomas the names of animals, to which he responded with his usual combination of enthusiasm and independent assessment. James Hollies brought a drawing, framed, that he had done of the mountains as seen from the back porch of the Donovan house, and which was extraordinary. Emma hung it in the parlor where it lived for the rest of her life. It was at this party that Tobias made a small speech that he had not warned Emma he was going to make, which he did quietly, standing on the back porch steps with his cup in his hand, while their friends and neighbors stood in the October garden. He said that 4 years ago, A woman had come to Redemption Creek on the morning train with one bag and the courage to start over, and that the town had been made better by her in ways that were visible in the school and the children and the work of the town council, and in 100 smaller ways that you only saw if you paid attention. He said that he paid attention. He said that he intended to keep doing so. Emma stood in the garden with Margaret on her hip and Thomas pulling at her skirt, and her face was warm and her eyes were very bright. He stepped down from the porch steps and came to her and kissed her cheek, which made Thomas express loud displeasure at being interrupted, and the garden laughed. The years settled into themselves after that with the deep contentment of a life that has found its shape. The children grew. The school grew. The town grew. The mountains did not change. Thomas, at 5, proved his grandmother's instinct correct and became an absolute demon at checkers, which he played with Tobias on Sunday afternoons with a focused intensity that suggested either a future in law or in some extremely competitive occupation that had not yet been invented. Margaret, at 3, was reading, which Emma had expected and Tobias found astonishing, even though he had watched the process day by day. Emma's letter to the nun in Galveston had opened a correspondence that continued steadily over the years. Sister Agnes, who was the nun's name, which made Emma smile every time she wrote the greeting, sent letters about the school in Galveston, and asked questions about the school in Redemption Creek with genuine professional curiosity. Emma answered in detail. The exchange had the quality of a conversation between equals, which was the best kind. She sent money to the Galveston school, beginning in 1886 when the household finances permitted it, small amounts at first and more as Tobias's salary improved, and the household found its equilibrium. Sister Agnes acknowledged this with characteristic brevity and said the children were grateful, which was all that needed to be said. In 1889, Colorado became a state, which the town of Redemption Creek celebrated with enthusiasm, appropriate to people who had been a territory for some time, and found the change significant. Tobias was at the ceremony in Denver as part of the official law enforcement contingent, and came back with a newspaper and the expression of a man who has witnessed something historic and is still processing it. Emma read the newspaper at the kitchen table while Margaret sat beside her and asked questions about everything, and Thomas sat across from them both and read his reader with the concentration of a boy who is not going to admit that the conversation is more interesting than the reading. "We are Coloradans now properly," Emma said. "We were before," Tobias said. "More officially," Emma said. "I will take it," he said. The letter from Patrick arrived in the spring of 1889 with the news that he was planning to marry a woman named Alice from Cheyenne, Wyoming, a schoolteacher, which made Emma laugh with the specific delight of someone who appreciates a pattern. Patrick and Alice Donovan visited Redemption Creek in the summer of 1889, and it was immediately clear that Alice was the right person for Patrick, because she listened to him with the tolerant affection of a woman who finds the harmonica charming and knows its limits. Emma liked her immediately. Alice and Emma sat on the back porch on the first evening and talked for 3 hours, while Tobias and Patrick sat inside with the children, and Patrick played the harmonica until Thomas fell asleep against his uncle's shoulder, and Margaret sat with round eyes and her chin in her hands, listening. Henry Cross and Frances Webb were married in October of 1889, in the same church where Emma and Tobias had been married, and Emma stood beside Frances and addressed the color of autumn grass, and felt the specific pleasure of witnessing a happiness you had, in some small way, made possible. Agnes Pierce danced at the wedding, which no one had expected, with Pete Hollies the blacksmith, who it turned out was a considerably better dancer than his bulk suggested, and who walked her home afterward with Governor the dog trotting alongside, which the whole town noticed and no one mentioned, because Redemption Creek knew how to be kind. Rosa Valdez provided the food at the wedding as she had provided it at Emma and Tobias's wedding, and at every subsequent occasion of importance in the town, because some things become tradition by virtue of being excellent, and there is no reason to change them. In 1890, Thomas started school, at the very school his mother had built, and in the very building she had organized, and in a class taught by Frances Cross, as she now was, which had its occasional awkwardness and many more moments of straightforward and specific delight. He sat in the second row, because the front row was occupied by a girl named Rose Henderson, Dr. Henderson's daughter, who had arranged her slate in chalk with the same precision that Lily Briggs had demonstrated 7 years before, and Thomas found this either annoying or fascinating depending on the day, which Emma, who heard about Rose Henderson with reliable frequency, thought was very interesting indeed. Margaret started school 2 years later in 1892 and sat in the front row immediately and cooperated entirely with whatever the teacher suggested, which Emma thought was also very interesting in a completely different way. Tobias retired from the sheriff's position in 1893 after 10 years, when Henry Cross was elected to replace him, which was as it should be. He did not miss it with the acute pain he had expected. He had done the work he came to do and had done it well, and the territory, now the state, was different than it had been, more settled, less raw, the particular violence of the frontier years giving way to something that had not arrived at entirely peaceful, but was on its way there slowly, in the way that social change moves slowly and unevenly and matters enormously. He did, in the years after, teach. Not in a schoolroom, though he occasionally helped Emma with the older students who were preparing for university entrance, which 3 of her students managed between 1888 and 1895. He taught through the paper he had begun publishing in the Denver Legal Journal, on law and evidence and justice in the West, papers that were read and cited, and that made some people uncomfortable, which he took as evidence they were necessary. He and Emma sat on the back porch on summer evenings after the children were in bed, sometimes talking and sometimes reading, sometimes simply sitting in the way that 2 people do when they have built enough shared silence that it requires no maintenance. The mountains were always there. The creek ran through the valley. The town made its sounds, familiar and changed and familiar again. She had come on the morning train in September of 1882 with 1 bag and a borrowed name, and a heart full of the particular kind of desperate determination that is what courage looks like when it is not wearing its best clothes. She had come with nothing and had found everything, not because the world had been kind. The world had been, for a long time, the opposite of kind, but because she had not stopped, and she had not accepted the version of herself that Victor Crane and circumstances had tried to impose on her, and because, in a small mountain town in Colorado, she had been seen clearly by a thorough, patient, coffee-drinking man with brown eyes and a tendency to notice things. She thought about this on a September evening in 1893, 11 years exactly from the morning she had stepped off the train, sitting on the back porch with Tobias beside her and Thomas, now 9, inside doing his schoolwork with tremendous reluctance, and Margaret, 7, asleep, and the mountains doing the thing they did in September, the first cold in the air and the aspens beginning to turn and the light going gold over the ridgeline. "What are you thinking about?" Tobias said. "The morning I got off the train," Emma said. "Were you afraid?" he said. "Enormously," she said, "but I did not feel it right then. Right then I was too busy looking at where I was." "And what did you see?" he said. She looked at the mountains, at the aspens, at the house that was theirs, the back porch, the garden, the path to the gate. "A beginning," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it the way he always had, with the certainty of a man who intends to keep doing this for as long as he is given to do it. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it was." The evening went on. The mountains went through their colors. Inside the house, Thomas made the sound of a boy who has finally given in to mathematics. Margaret slept the deep sleep of a child who is entirely safe. Agnes Pierce, who had come for dinner and stayed, as she often did, was washing dishes in the kitchen and could be heard doing so with the companionable noise of someone who is entirely at home. The creek ran in the valley below. The last light left the peak slowly, reluctantly, the way good things end, holding on a moment longer than strictly necessary, which is perhaps the truest form of grace. Emma Bailey Donovan was 35 years old and she was home. She had come on the morning train with one bag and a borrowed name, and she had built, from that borrowed beginning, a life that was entirely and completely her own.